Welcome to Sounds Like Portraits. I'm Philip Ungar. This podcast is all about creativity. Where are you going? Whatever your destination, you need a map. It gives you a boundary box for how to place yourself in the world. I met cartographer Chanba. She loves drawing maps because she said she can place herself in them. Is mapping a subjective process? She said yes. Can it be biased? Of course, she said. Really? Listen to her talking about her mapping process. But before, she told me what she tried to do all her life.
All my life, I've always tried to laugh. It always changes the color of what you're happening to be doing, and I think that there's always a reason to laugh. If I can find a reason to laugh, it also makes things more interesting to me. It kind of changes the level that you operate under.
In which way?
It reverses things or makes things opposite of what you expect. So if you're working under a mindset that might be difficult for you or that you don't understand, it can make things relatable or give you a playing field. When things seem intimidating or wrong, when you can laugh about them, it makes them familiar, easier to work with.
Less impressive.
Yeah, exactly.
Being interviewed, is it a situation you would like to laugh about?
I think it's funny for me because I consider myself such a goofy person, and an interview is a serious situation where your voice can teach or it's intimidating a bit.
You're a cartographer. How would you define what a map is for?
So a map is a representation of place, and I think that it helps people relate to and imagine large spaces. It kind of brings things, I guess, similar to the way that comedy does, brings things down a little bit. So you have giant areas that you can't fathom, and a map gives you this boundary box for how to place yourself in the world, and it also helps you imagine different places. I think I love looking at maps, or even more than I love looking at them, I love drawing them because you kind of place yourself in them and it helps you to, I guess, understand the world.
So the way you're describing what a map is very similar to the way you could describe what an artwork is.
I think cartographers are artists, definitely. I think the way that one chooses to represent the world is an expression, and it's expression of bias, it's of hierarchy of what one thinks is important. There are so many choices that you make as a cartographer about how you label things, about what you display, about the colors that you use to display things that are hugely impactful for the way that people see and experience the world. So the way that I see it and the way that I've always worked with maps is an artistic expression as an illustration.
Would you say that there's something subjective in your mapping process?
100%. I think every mapping process is subjective. Even Google Maps is subjective. I think creating a one-to-one map, meaning a map that is the world, is not possible. It's always at the discretion of the person or the people who are creating it.
There's a quote by Jason saying, mapping is an act of power. Mm-hmm. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I 100% agree with it. I think that its influence and its truth in a profound way, because maps have an extraordinary power to display truth, not like many other types of expressions where people are used to seeing the bias in things. A simple example, why do we show the US and Europe in the center of every map? Why are they the largest? Why are they projected to be the largest areas? I studied journalism. We were always taught this principle, and I think when people are taught to read articles or to read books or to see artworks, they understand that it's subjective. But when someone sees a map, because of the spatial relationship, because it's a representation of what should be reality, like the place that your feet are on, it has an enormous power to speak to truth. So as the person who is creating that map, being very critical about the data that you're representing and the manner in which you represent it is an act of power, because you can influence anyone who looks at it. You have to be really careful with that power. Very wary about using pre-made base maps, or like just plopping in Google Map and using it as the base, because you're telling the world that that's the truth for what the world looks like and exists to be, and not many people see the bias or are trained to.
What's the risk for the users not to understand that there's a power behind the mapping?
I mean, there are very many risks as far as the way that digital maps are being used right now, and one of those risks is rendering people unable to read maps. Like, it makes it so easy to navigate. For example, only the businesses that Google chooses to show on the map are going to be relevant to people walking. So if advertisement money is being paid to Google Maps just because those businesses have the money to allow themselves to appear on the map, they are then the only things that people see, and like that, those are the landmarks that decorate, navigating around a place. And as more businesses appear and start to overshadow other things, like even parks or streets, then they become more important. And do we really want our maps to be a series of choices made on advertising money? Is that like how we want to represent the world? It's worth questioning. Also, political boundaries appear differently depending on where you are in the world or where you are looking at Google Maps. For example, if you're viewing a Google map in Russia, the borders of Ukraine are a bit different than they are if you're viewing it in America. So how the story of boundaries is being told varies depending on what map you're seeing.
Tell me what a bad mapping is for you.
I guess I experience it fairly often when I go to new places, and I focus on transportation. I'm really obsessed with all kinds of transportation maps. So when I come to a new city and I'm trying to navigate a new bus network or a bike network, and I'm hindered from doing that because I cannot read the map or I don't trust it, then it's like a very bad map. And I guess it's the same problem that someone just put in the data for different transit lines and let the software create the map and didn't think about where my eye would start and where it would need to finish, and give the idea of certainty that a bus is going to come. Because when you're looking at a static map, having it look unfriendly or outdated or illegible very much impacts one's perception of the service. So if I see that someone didn't care about how I'm going to read the map, then I don't really trust that I'll be able to take the bus and that it'll get me where I'm going. I think clutter is a huge problem. Mapping is really a design task that deals a lot with hierarchy, so it's often a lot of information layered on top of itself, and especially if you're doing static graphics. So a designer has to be very careful about what information it chooses to show first, and that we're not bogged down with the level of detail. So if I see a bus map and there will be like 25 or 30 routes and I can't read labels on any of them, or I can't see where they start or finish, and I don't know where they go after they intersect because of poor color choices, then it's like useless.
And do you think that the user needs to know something to use the map?
That's a good question. So for transportation, many people now have smartphones, and they can just, almost everybody does, so they can normally plan an A to B trip on their phone, and they don't necessarily need to read any map in order to do that. But to get a whole idea of the city, I think is like a really good purpose for it. And I guess your question was, do you need any prior knowledge to be able to use it? I don't think so. And I think the best maps, you rarely even have to look at a legend. Like, you see it and it's so intuitive about where a line starts and where it finishes. Like, one of my favorite maps is Lance Wyman's map of Washington, D.C., which is like a very noble city. The map that he created is just so timeless and friendly and iconesque. In one graphic, it just places the entire layout of the city in your mind, and in this very humble way where it can be used by anybody. And you feel that. You don't feel intimidated when you look at that map. And I think for the capital of the United States, and especially a city with so much history and so many beautiful icons and monuments, it's like a perfect representation.
What kind of questions do you have in mind when you start a new mapping process?
I start with, what is this place like on the ground? And normally, the kind of projects I go for are cities that want to reinvent or get more people interested in using public transit, maybe cities that don't necessarily have a culture for it. So I recently did a project in the city of Key West, which is a great place to get around by bike and walk, but for one reason or another, it has a lot of congestion, and it was actually voted number one, not voted, but deemed number one in vehicle pedestrian and vehicle cyclist accidents. So they were given a grant to increase public transportation options, and just having more cars come to the island doesn't make any sense. There's not much space there, and it's like a very heavy drinking city, so not safe, and they don't need it. So my question was, how do you get around by bike? And what kind of transportation options are there? What am I actually seeing on the road? And who are the people that are biking? And how integrated are they in the city? Is there a culture for biking already? So normally I like to go to the place I'm about to map, and I bike the roads, and I actually see what the facilities are like. And I talk to people on different sides of the equation. So I interview, like you do too. I talk to law enforcement and see what the issues are: traffic, bike, pedestrian. I talk to advocacy folks, and then I just talk to people on the street and ask them if they would consider biking or not, why or why not. And those questions kind of lead me to understanding how and where that map might need to exist.
Did you ever experience unexpected cultural challenges from the users in your mapping process?
Definitely. I mean, the bikes in Key West that are being rented get rented out with a cup holder. So, do you really want to encourage drinking while biking? And is that part of the campaign? That was a challenge for me, especially since bike safety is such a big concern. And I'm really interested in getting people who are not necessarily comfortable biking to be comfortable with it. So, I always try to enforce safety and comfort into the maps that I make, and try to make it a smooth transition.
Are there universal conventions in mapping?
There are. There's labeling conventions. There's placement of labels, types of fonts that you might use for land versus place, city names versus environmental factors. There's a very well-known style of hill shading for drawing mountains, and it's a beautiful art form and convention. There's kind of a whole school of cartography that many people are super fascinated by and are historians of it, and especially for color coding. I don't subscribe to a lot of convention in my life in general, because I'm not very academic. I like to play and experiment with things, and I just like seeing how people react, because I think if something works, then you don't need convention. Why? What is it there for?
Would you say that the mapping process is a translating process?
Yeah, I mean, it's a narrative. Semiotics, general, is a field that is about translating the real to the symbolic, and in a way that the most people can understand. I mean, it's very hard because you're speaking to a huge number of people. So to translate something that can be like very personal, especially a relationship with the city, and often emotional, I think that's why I love mapping, because you can start to get to like those details, or the spirit of the city, and design is great for doing that. And you can't just like, you can't put the same map of Chicago in New York. Like, it's not the same city. So translating that is interesting. It's the art behind it, I guess.
Do you need to know the places you're mapping?
I think so.
Do you need to have an experience of them?
Yes, I think that you do. Of course, I've mapped places that I've never been to, but I try to feel into them by like looking at photos, or looking at important institutions there, or artists, or character, music. Just get inspired by the feel of that place. And I think even when you work for a place like Google or Apple Maps, you do need to know what it's like to be there or to see a map in that place, because there are very subtle things that make a place its own. Like, you can't use the same symbol for metro on a map in Seoul as you do in New York. Like, people will not be able to read it. Neighborhood names are like a big thing. They aren't necessarily defined, and you can only get that knowledge from local sources, the people that like see where that division is, feel it. So I think that you do, even if you're trying to create a universal map of the world.
So that's about mapping the physical space. What about the cyberspace, which is not a georeference space?
So it's interesting because I kind of think, or there's a conversation about mapping metro systems that is completely separate from the street geography. Like, it's a system that exists underground. It has to like relate to the geography, but people can't see it. This is operating underground, so it's like the map of the metro can really look, you can draw the connections totally separate from geography. And like, some people argue that a metro system wouldn't even exist without the map of it. Like, the map is the system because you can't see it. Mapping things that are outside of geography is a similar process. It's like creating connections between things, networks and connections. I understand this concept. It's not something I do have a ton of experience with, but I think showing relationships and following paths and aiding people along those journeys is something that is important, and no matter what kind of map you show. I did an acupuncture diagram once, and it's a similar thing, like mapping the path of the heart or of the lung, and creating the hierarchy, seeing the pathways.
I'm gonna leave the room, hold the microphone, and please add whatever you want to the interview.
Sure. Thank you very much for listening, and if you do ever get the opportunity to do an interview, I think it's a great way to think about your process. So thank you very much, Philippe, and I hope you enjoyed listening. Enjoy your day.
Thank you, Chanba, for sharing your story. This is Sounds Like Portraits, a podcast by Philippe Ungar. Music, Charmeuse de Serpent, composed and conducted by Olivier Glisson. See you soon for the next episode.